For our next technique we're going to look at is probably my favorite, is spattering. All right, so there's two different types of using paint in a very expressive way. You may have seen paintings by such artists as Jackson Pollock, which are very expressive, very action-oriented in its application. But the two that come up in scenic artistry are spattering and splattering. The two different techniques is spattering is a little more controlled. Splattering is where you're throwing paint and it's a very messy process. So in this particular technique we're going to look at is spattering. Okay, so spattering is we will use the same background we used before. So we have our scumble base coat that we did. I've got a little bit of over from the last project, but what I'm using is two brushes. You can use a brush and a piece of stick or a paint stick, for example. Often we'll use a paint stick. I've mixed up a little bit of my blue, my phthalo blue here with a little bit of water and medium to create sort of the consistency of motor oil or cooking oil. Not too thick, not too thin. I want it kind of in the middle. All right, so I've got that saturated pretty good. And I'm using, in this case, I'm using a second paint brush. The way to approach this is if you have more paint, you'll tend to get a chunk or like more, a thicker paint, you'll have sort of a chunky spatter, where if you have a very thin paint, you may have a very a translucent type of transparent type of a spatter. So what we want to do here is we're going to lightly tap and find the right pressure to get little dots. These little dots are the paint kind of flicking off of my paintbrush onto my surface. And this is great for almost like an airbrush technique. We often do this to kind of even out a paint, to make a whole piece feel unified. You see I'm getting a nice variety of paint spatters on there. All right, so I can mix this up if I like. I can go to a different color, add different values, different hues. I still have some of the red from the last project, so I'm going to mix a little bit of white in there, kind of get a pink. All right, so I got some that paint is not looking too good. All right, so I can pull some of that off. And I can do the same thing with that kind of pinky color on top. I'm not worried if you get it into one of your other areas, that's fine. If you want to be very careful, you can always put a sheet of paper over it so that it's very controlled in where you put it. So right now I've got this sort of purpley pink color and this sort of and my phthalo blue as my two paint spatters. All right, so that's it. That's really all it is. The thicker the paint, the chunkier it is, and ends up being kind of impasto looking. We typically like the consistency of like a motor oil in our paint. Or even a very light lotion kind of I even sometimes say like the consistency of milk is a good gauge. So right in that range of that type of texture is where we want to be with our paint. If it's straight paint right out of the can, right out of the tube, it's typically too thick. It will not do this effect, right? If you're going with a lot of paint and you're loading up a large brush, for example, like this is my big lay-in brush. We take a big lay-in brush, we can do the same thing, dip this in our pre-made paint. Typically it's a gallon or 2 gallons of paint. And by using a big paint stick, I can do the same thing. If I really want to, I can get to throwing it, just whipping this guy around and the paint will fly off the ends. And typically that is more of a splattering technique. You end up getting splatters, very organic kind of splashes everywhere. All right, so that's the difference between the two, and you can see what we get. we're starting to get a nice collection here of colors. As I peel off my paint, my tape here, you can start to see some of the variation in, say, more tape here, and say our little spattering here versus something like the last technique, which we did was our flogging. We did flogging with a flogger versus the sponging we did earlier on. So you see these textures look very different between the three, not just color, but texture. All right, so play with this. Try to do one or two different spatterers. Take your 2 brushes, or take a brush and maybe a spoon or a stick or anything else that you can just tap this against to allow the paint to flick off. All right, you might test this on a different piece of paper first just to kind of get a feel for it, but I think you'll enjoy this one. All right, thanks. See you on the next one.